Hello. This will be a brief video walking you through the user experience with QMF for WebSphere. That user experience is related to QMF for Workstation. I have both applications on the screen at present. And as you can see, the user interfaces are essentially the same. QMF for Workstation installs on a Windows workstation and it has access to the files, printers, and other resources on the Windows machine. QMF for WebSphere installs on a remote web application server, and an end user gets access through a web browser. Here I'm coming in through Google Chrome. There's perhaps a 90 to 95% overlap between what you can do in the QMF for WebSphere and what you can do in QMF for Workstation. So I'm going to focus on QMF for WebSphere, and at the end come back to QMF for Workstation and have a quick look at what's different. Now, QMF for WebSphere is a member of the QMF family of products. The original QMF product was a mainframe product, QMF for TSO, that installs and runs on the mainframe. If your colleagues or if yourself have been using QMF for TSO, then your QMF for WebSphere will have access to the QMF objects, the queries, the procedures, the reports that were created in QMF for TSO. And likewise, your QMF for TSO colleagues will have access to the ones that you create in QMF for WebSphere and QMF for Workstation. Now, when you start a QMF session, you have two decisions to make. Which data source will you connect to? And once you make that connection, would you like to make a new query or work with a pre-existing one? I'm connected with a user ID, db2admin, and so I have a pre-assigned workspace for myself where in the past I've included the data sources that I typically go to and some of the reports or queries that I've created. Here I have a DB2 for Windows, an Oracle, DB2 for ZOS, two of them, and some IMS data. I'm going to go to this DB2 for ZOS, and here where I have the QMF catalog, I have a listing of the queries that have been created in the past by QMF for TSO. This particular user has a query that I'm interested in. I double-clicked on it. It brings that query up, and it's showing it to me in our query building view. Now the SQL is shown at the bottom of the screen. Here, the table columns, associated tables that I may choose to join into this query, and the current columns of choice. I'm going to add in the phone and zip code. As you can see, they popped up here and they're now in the SQL. I can add a row condition, a where clause, where I'm interested in seeing the amount greater than 500. Right? And that's now down here as part of the SQL. If I get to the point where I need to do something more sophisticated than picking the columns, sorting them, doing grouping and aggregation, I click on the SQL tab down here at the bottom of the screen. It gives me the SQL view, and now I can begin using my SQL skills to key in or to copy and paste in the rest of the SQL. Okay. When I'm happy with this, I click the Run button. It makes the connection to the database, and I get the data back almost instantly. If I'm happy with this result, I can save the query back to that QMF catalog, and I can share it with other users. So when this save completes, now any of my QMF for TSO colleagues or my other QMF for WebSphere or QMF for Workstation colleagues will all have access to this query that I created and saved. Now the query is one of the two main QMF objects. The other main traditional QMF object, I should say, is called the procedure. A procedure is a simple scripting language object that bundles together multiple queries, reports, or even other procedures, and then runs them all at once. So instead of you having to go through a routine of running the same objects over and over on a regular basis, you can bundle them into a single object and run that once. Now, one that I'm interested in is very simple. It runs another procedure, then it runs a second procedure, and then it displays a table name, a table. Each of these procedures in turn does a number of actions, and we'll run it and then I'll explain what the goal is. Okay, so this actually came from a customer that I was helping out. It runs first this procedure that runs a query, saves the result set, then runs a second query that counts the records in that result set, and then saves that count. That query that it ran gets distributed to a particular number of users who have to see this data along with a timestamp of when it was run. A count was taken. A second query was run that got distributed to a second set of consumers. And then in the end, those counts were recorded in a table because the person's manager needed to see a listing by date and time, how many records were run, which reports, and for which regions they were sent to. Okay. So instead of having to run all of those manually, distribute them, total them up, and send the report, the user put together this simple proc, so there's just this one object to run. The procedure scripting language is extremely powerful, and in many cases it's the end game for users who are writing queries and running reports. I'm going to clean up here by closing them all down, and now we'll move on. If you do not have a QMF for TSO user base or clients that you need to, or colleagues that you need to interact with, QMF for Workstation and WebSphere give you the ability to take the results of your queries and move them into the graphical user interface world so that you can do things that really wouldn't have a play in the mainframe environment. So, for example, this query seems to be just an SQL query. It has 6 columns, and I like to point out the rightmost column is called amount. When this runs, however, QMF for WebSphere post-processes the results by doing some exception formatting, looking for values that are above a particular threshold or another threshold, and highlighting them in red or green. Putting the data into an expandable, collapsible object so I can look at a summary report and any level of the detail without having to write multiple queries, one to do a group by and one to give the raw data. In addition to that post-processing, this query has been set up to include several charts of the data. So if instead of looking at rows and columns, I'd like to look at a visualization, those are built into the query object themselves. So these are things that really wouldn't have a play in the TSO environment. Now, one other aspect of this this query that's worth pointing out is I made the point that there were 6 columns, it ends with amount, but we see a 7th column here called commission. Okay. What commission is something called a calculated column. Now, certainly I can create columns in the SQL if I have the appropriate skills. But what happens with this column is this might have been a little, I would have had to go to the reference books for this one. Using some functions built in to QMF for the calculated columns, I'm saying if the amount column is greater than 1200, then I'd like the commission to be the amount times 1%. Otherwise, make it be the amount times 5%. And so that's where this commission column is coming from. The database delivered the data to QMF for WebSphere. QMF for WebSphere calculated that column and then made it available for the charts, the roll-up, etc. in this presentation. Now, another layer up for what QMF can do with the visualization is shown in this object called an ad hoc report. So again, at an earlier point in time, I took a couple of queries that I'd written and I put them together on a palette like this. So again, I have this drillable result set grid, and if I study it, I can see that Utah looks like it has the smallest amount, and so I could drill into Utah to see what may have happened to account for that. But at the same time, in parallel, I have these charts of the same data. No studying, Utah is the smallest, and when I click on this, it broadcasts to these other two charts that Utah is what I'm interested in. And looking down here, I see institutions is the shortest or smallest one. And that broadcasts to the grid to just zoom in on institutions. So by putting my queries out as a drillable grid with associated drillable charts, I can make a bigger, more robust object that will help me analyze what has exactly been going on with my results. Okay. This setup is done through a simple drag and drop interface with an editing view that allows me to pick the chart types that I'd like and decide where the broadcasts and the links are going. And then finally, one step up from there is an object called a dashboard. What the dashboard does is similar to that ad hoc report. However, in this particular one, I have more than just one query. I have 7 distinct queries, and those 7 queries are going to different data sources. And each query is coming back and being presented in a different mode, a different presentation type. Like the ad hoc report, it is interactive, but it has more degrees of interaction. So for example, I have a drop-down list here that was powered by one of the queries. I'll look at Team B. That propagates to the rest of the presentation. Third quarter, what happened in first quarter. Okay, and things were different. These dashboards can have more than one page, or scene as they're called in the dashboard world. And so after looking at the high level on this particular dashboard, I can drill into some more detail, and just as before, I can swap around the look until I drill in on what I'm interested in. When I come back to the main scene, I did add one more capability here. With this button for email, we'll take a snapshot of this dashboard in its current state and send it to the people on a CC list. And so an email just went out that had that particular this particular look for it. Now, this whole interaction is all within the interface that we see here. And here's an email that just showed up with a PDF of that shot. Okay, so back to the presentation. I start to say this dashboard and everything else we've been doing has been presented completely inside this QMF user interface. We give you the ability to free yourself here with the concept of what's called a web link. So I picked a particular query, one I showed you earlier, When I do this process, it creates a URL that I can distribute to other people to put in their favorites, or distribute to my web designers so they can embed it in pages that will just give me menu lists. And what this is going to do for me is allow me to skip the rest of the user interface. I still do have to authenticate. And it can deliver me the results in whatever surrounding interface my web developers or I can put together. But like I said, that URL itself can just go into the favorites list, and you can build a folder that just gets you the report results. And finally, for some of these reports, or some of these actions, such as that procedure that I had shown earlier that did the multiple reports along with the final summary report, QMF for WebSphere has a built-in scheduler that allows you to make a connection, add a scheduled task, pick a procedure or a query, and as you walk through the wizard making the choices as to what you'd like to have happen, in the end you have the ability to schedule that task with the QMF for WebSphere scheduler, to schedule on an hourly basis or by the minute, on a weekly basis where you pick the days, on a monthly basis likewise. And as long as your web application server is running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, these tasks, the queries and procedures, will be executed unattended and email out results, say like this dashboard did, or send things to printers and so forth. Okay, so that, in a very condensed presentation, is the QMF for WebSphere user interface. The main difference with QMF for Workstation is those dashboards that I showed at the end, those can only be created in QMF for Workstation. There's a little bit more development and heavy lifting that the dashboards require. So at this point in time, the dashboards themselves are built in this type of a GUI building interface. Okay. The other main difference comes when users do get a result set. An extremely popular thing to do with the results is to export them to an Excel spreadsheet. Well, because you are on the desktop with the workstation, it's a very simple matter to get the results, the data, and a pivot table created in a spreadsheet. For that same type of activity, things that need to interact with the Windows desktop, when you're in QMF for WebSphere, you'll still have to deal with the idea of downloading from a remote web application server. And I'm sure everybody's had experience with that. That here, when I want to export to Excel, it downloads the file, and then I need to manually say OK, show in folder, or open it. Okay. So there will be a few places where the barrier of QMF running at the remote web application server will be not quite as smooth. But for the most part, writing the queries, running them, looking at the results, getting them downloaded in spreadsheets, not much of a difference or barrier between QMF for WebSphere and QMF for Workstation. The real key comes in the development of the most sophisticated object, the dashboard applications that QMF makes. Well, thank you for your patience with all of this. You get a much better sense by getting a trial version of QMF Workstation and WebSphere, or by scheduling a 1 to 2 hour demo with any of the staff here that back up a QMF. So with that, I'm going to bring this to a close, and feel free to get in touch with any questions.